Well, it wasn't that many years ago that the official number given for the Chinese holdings of U.S. treasuries was over $1 trillion. So that since we're now in the 700, 800 range, it's clear that not only in the last 3 months, but for some years now, the trend is clearly down. Sometimes it levels off for a while for whatever complicated reasons, but clearly the Chinese government, the Chinese authorities in the Chinese bank want to reduce their exposure to US dollars. And one can speculate all one wants around it. There are usually multiple reasons, but among them, no question at all, is the fact that the United States' indebtedness, and let's remember, the United States is the largest debtor country in the world, has been a problem for quite some time. And the recent budget, the so-called big, beautiful bill that Mr. Trump and his Republican Congress passed, makes all that worse. It continues trillion-dollar deficits basically into the indefinite future, and we're already at a very high debt level in terms of the history of the United States, in terms of the ratio between the national debt and the GDP. However you look at this, and there are multiple ways, many people in China, but also many people around the world, including here in the United States, believe with the Bank of China that this level of indebtedness, not even speaking of the growth, this level of growth of the deficits and the debts that result from the deficits is quote unquote unsustainable. Now that's a funny word because it doesn't tell you all that much. It's a prediction about the future, and we know what those are worth when any of us does that. So yeah, you probably can't sustain this, but no one knows for how long you can, because that immediately forces you to ask, look how long they have in fact sustained it. The United States has been a deficit country now for quite a while, and its debts around the world have grown quite a while. Countries around the world accumulate dollars. They're willing to do it. The United States, in case people don't understand it, gets enormous, let me underscore the word enormous benefits by having the dollar be the global currency. Just to give you one example, it is difficult in all countries to fight wars, but it is always more difficult if you tax your people to pay for the war. If you want to see support for a war disappear in terms of popularity, just try paying for it with taxes. So what you do instead is borrow so that you don't have to tax your people. The borrowing is a much more, how shall I put it, pleasurable way for politicians to cover the cost. And if the whole world is willing to lend you money, which has been the case, then the United States can be the world's police person or military, the way we talk about, and you talk about on your program a great deal, in part because of the reserve position of the dollar, of the fact that the world has been willing to lend. But as with all things like this, eventually, if you keep doing it, you will destroy it. You will overdo it. And that's the issue that really is coming to the fore now. The world's owners of American debt, and just to remind, the single largest creditor of the United States is is Japan. The second is China. The third is Britain. Okay, all of them and the many others that hold American debt are very worried by the level of debt being added to all the time, because that's the way the Republicans and the Democrats resolve their contradictions. It's a very bizarre dysfunction of American capitalism that our political leaders, Democrats supporting public spending, roughly speaking, Republicans supporting no taxes for corporations and the rich, how do you resolve, if you're not going to tax the corporations and the rich, to pay for the spending that you better do, or else you'll lose the people's support? The solution? You go to the corporations and the rich and you say, on condition of not taxing you, which we won't, you have to lend us the money we would have taxed from you if we had the courage to tax you. We don't, in America, there is no courage politically, so they don't tax corporations and the rich. They keep cutting the taxes, as they did a few weeks ago, again, under Mr. Trump, having done it in his first presidency back in 2017. And so they borrow instead from the corporations and the rich. We call that public finance, but it is a corrupt hustle if you're honest. Well, that then has this side effect of making us a debtor country. We're borrowing forever. And now the terrible fear, which is always there in every creditor for thousands of years. I want to lend, I'm making a lot of money by lending, but I've got to be careful not to lend to whoever borrows from me if there's a chance they won't pay it back. Well, the United States, being the dominant country, has been able to shoo that away. Oh, of course, we will never default. But smart politicians, which exist in China and everywhere else, understand that at a certain point, it won't be up to the politicians. There will be a groundswell from below, and then it will force the hand. And the politicians, having no courage, can't face their own people, will start cutting back, paying off their creditors. And you don't want to be holding the U.S. Treasury when that moment happens, whether you're the Chinese bank or the Japanese authorities or anyone else. That's where we are. It is so serious that there is now public conversation and the action. The Chinese are not alone. Others have also been paring their holdings of the dollar. There's still, you can still borrow. I don't want to overstate this, but we haven't had this kind of discussion before, and it tells you that we are coming toward the end of this game that has been played at least since the United States went off the gold standard in 1971.
Yeah, Sean, I know you've been covering this development in particular relating to China. I just want to pull up this article again on what the Chinese researchers at the People's Bank of China said. In addition, because I know you've been covering this a lot too, they said, this is just straight up, we need to gradually adjust treasury holdings and appropriately increase reserves of gold, key resources in minerals. So, Sean, talk about the significance of this. What does it mean? Why is it happening?
Right, I think to Richard's point, right, he's exactly right. The US debt has now reached an unsustainable trajectory. Now, I think just recently, the interest on the debt alone, just the interest, we don't even need to talk about the capital, it's around $1 trillion. And we still have 2 to 3 months to go for the fiscal year. So it's going to hit 1.2 or 1.3 trillion. Now, the problem with this situation is that China understands that there are two negatives in holding US bonds, US debt, US treasuries, whatever you want to call it, right? Now, the first thing is the fiscal situation and the fate of the dollar. The strength of the dollar is likely going to crash, likely going to go lower over the next few months, maybe even the next few years. And we need to understand why, right? Now, I think the trade war really sent the dollar into a doom spiral. Because let's say you're an exporter or country that you want to shift your industries to the United States for some reason, whatever the reason is, you will need guarantees from the Trump administration and the administrations going forward. And the most important guarantee you need is for the tariffs to stay. It doesn't make sense if the tariffs, let's say for steel, aluminum, or for cars, let's say it's around 30 to 50%. Within the next 4 years, it suddenly goes away. Well, you're going to be the big loser, right? You look like an idiot if you build a factory for a few $1 billion. You want the tariffs to stay as someone who's going to shift their industries there. But here comes the crux. The US doesn't have robust supply chains, labor is too expensive, which means in order to keep these tariffs going, they will need to print money, they will need to borrow money, and they will need to subsidize their industries going forward. Now, if you think about this from a really technical standpoint, that means they're going to issue a lot more bonds going forward. They're going to flood the market with treasuries. And it really doesn't matter if they issue bonds on the short end, whether it's 3 months all the way to the 1 year, or whether it's 10 to 20 years. Bonds, which we all kind of know it's going to be quite impossible, because if they do it, they will blow up the entire market. And a lot of people have a pushback that, hey, Trump is going to send his goon squad into the Federal Reserve. He and his henchmen, they're going to kick power out, and they're going to slam the rates down all the way to 2%, 1%, and 0%. Now, sure, that might lower borrowing costs for the immediate future, but we've got to understand at the end of the day, the entire market runs on supply and demand. There comes a limit, as Professor Wolff said, that you flood the market with so much dollars, so much bonds, you borrow so much dollars in the world, it will come to a point that the world just don't have enough dollars to lend you. So rates goes up, and that destabilizes the entire US economy. And every time that happens, whether it's 08, 2020, the US will be forced to corner, and they'll be forced to print money, or else the entire economy collapses. Now, China understands this. So if that's the case, why do you want to hold the dollar bonds, which are denominated in dollar? That's the underlying asset. It's going to lose value, right? It really doesn't make sense. So let's say 10-year bond yields 4 to 5%, right? Somewhere around there. And the strength of the dollar drops another 10 to 20%. Well, you'll be losing 5 years of return. Plus, China also understands that US assets can be weaponized against them. Now, if we look at, for example, the recent talk between Trump and Putin, a lot of things were said. But one thing I was trying to get notified on, or really put my ear to the ground, was what is going to happen to the fate of the Russian assets, right? Around 200 to 300 billion dollars was seized by the Europeans and the Americans, and we have not really heard a whisper about it. And if this really continues, China understands that, hey, Russia lost $300 billion, but we have 750 to around $900 billion dollars stuck in the American system. So now they are juggling with two big conundrums. Our money can be taken away, and it can be used to weaponize against. It will be weaponized against us, and that can be used to beef up the U.S. military. That can be used to subsidize U.S. industries, and that can be used in all sorts of ways that we haven't really thought about it. We could even be building bases around the world to kind of encircle China a bit more. There's a possibility. And on the very direct side, why would you want to buy billions, hundreds of billions of bonds to subsidize Trump's trade war against you, right? Money is fungible. I mean, it's really incredulous. I mean, you just look at the situation, let's say, for example, in chips. The US wants to impose a 30% tariff on chips because they want to deny China the ability to get chips from, Korea, Taiwan, ship everything to the US. Now, how is Trump going to fund this fantasy idea? He has to borrow money. And does the Chinese want to fund their own containment of the tech war? Now, I find it highly implausible, and I don't think that's going to happen. So that's why we are seeing, all the Chinese economists, all the people in the banks, they're all writing this, because they know that at the end of the day, why would you want to fund your adversary? It fundamentally doesn't make sense.
Yeah, and to your point, Sean, and Professor Wolff, you can definitely comment on this. We've been being told in recent days, dollar is up, dollar is up. They want you to look at almost like day by day how it's going, but even day by day, it's often falling, and it's falling quite a lot. So this was just over the weekend. It's the dollar index fell by quite a lot, by almost 0.5%. So Professor Wolff, to what Sean was saying, what do you make of the broader significance then of the decline and what seems to be the eventual collapse of what we call dollar hegemony, the hegemony of the dollar as the reserve currency, given as what Chinese researchers at the Bank of China are calling this credibility crisis that Sean, I think, really pointed out well?
Well, I think what the Chinese authorities do, which authorities everywhere do, is weigh all these different factors. Sean nicely goes through a bunch of the very important ones, and they weigh them. They don't all point in the same direction. Otherwise, the weighing would be, you wouldn't need to. If they all point in doing X, you'd do X. But some of them point in direction X and others in direction Y. Let me give you an example from the United States. The benefit of the United States in having China subsidize American domestic and foreign policy by picking up, hundreds of billions of dollars of American debt is offset by the fact, which by the way is carefully not spoken about in the United States, that if you are China and you own whatever it is, let's say 700 or 800 billion dollars of American debt, that the American government is required to pay interest on that debt. And if the interest is 5%, let's say, and if it is $800 billion that China owns, then $40 billion a year is collected in taxes by the United States government. It is not used for American military. It's not used to maintain the roads or to help the students or whatever else the government does. The government functions merely as a collection agency and ships those $40 billion of taxpayer money to Beijing. That's Chinese interest on the debt of the United States, which the Chinese are free to use in any way they see fit, which I'm sure they do. But the United States does that, tries to keep it from its own people, because every time I explain this to an American audience, I can assure you the looks I get are the looks of people who have just discovered that, the sky is blue or something. It's extraordinary. But it's the weighing of the American government, which understands this, that the benefit of China buying the debt is greater than the loss, if you like, of the 40 billion that goes to subsidize China rather than the United States. And they are equally concerned now because they don't want the Chinese to unload in a short period of time significant parts of that debt, because that would crash the price of those bonds. And as we all know, that would raise interest rates. And China's a big enough player that this would be all kinds of problem around the world, would be as destabilizing of the world economy as almost anything else you could think of. So that has to be managed as well. So for me, I see them, the Americans in their way, but the Chinese authorities also in their way, as caught in a web of complicated relationships. And I think Mr. Trump, in his frustration, and of course I speak for the forces behind him, not him as an individual, he doesn't matter, but the forces behind him, in their frustration at being caught, and being caught at a time when the American empire and system is clearly declining, and the Chinese, not empire, but system is rising. The whole world can see that, Americans too. It's very painful to live in that frustration, and then they act impulsively. That's what these tariffs are about, and the sanctions are about. And they are in the process of discovering, when you suddenly destabilize all these webs, it is impossible to know how that works out, and it can just as likely work out at your expense, that would be the American expense, as that of anybody else. And that horrible fear is what can't be spoken in the United States.
Yeah, Sean, to you, because when we see this trend, I think it can be difficult for especially ordinary people in the West, in the United States in particular, to understand it. So how do you understand this just the ongoing trend, and it's not stopping, despite what the mainstream kind of market watchers and economic analysts try to tell us, that it's only this month, it's only yesterday, right? But it seems like this is happening. And I know you recently covered how it's been going on for all of 2025 so far.
Yep, I think the dollar has the curse, and it's a curse and a gift of the reserve currency status, right? Post World War II, when the US was very rich, when Europe, especially the UK, were in shambles, they were able to propagate the power of the dollar because the US was a manufacturing economy then, and they parlayed it into the petrodollar system where the whole world had to use dollars to get oil. And because of that, the US had near sheer dominance for the last 40 to 50 years, right? That part is undisputed. But when the entire US economy is faltering, when the entire trading system is cracking, when the entire financial system is losing trust, we are looking at a great unwinding of the entire dollar system, right? So let's just use the US consumer and just use trade, for example. Now, the US consumer, they are subsidized by the US government. A lot of government spending is buying foreign goods. But right now, we are reaching a point where the government, they are reaching a point that they can't really spend. The US consumers, they are facing high inflation. Inflation expectations are going up. They are spending less as well. So what are we really seeing going on a really technical basis, right? Well, they're not really importing a lot of goods from the world. Imports are starting to fall, and they're buying more overpriced US goods. So a lot of money is being circulated within the US economy. And when you have basically so much supply going on and the demand isn't really there to spend, it just lowers the strength of the dollar. And that's just going on within the United States itself. They're spending so much money on healthcare, which is necessary, but then they are waging a lot of foreign adventures around the world, which is just injecting more money, more bonds, more debt into the system, and everyone's really feeling the pain. They say inflation is just 3% a year. I don't really believe it. I think it's at least double or even triple, right? And I have friends in America, ask them how stuff in Target and Walmart, they tell me it's horrendous. They are facing double-digit inflation. And when we look at the financial side, it is just horrible as well. Now, let's understand that around 25%, 26% of US bonds are being held by foreigners out there. It's being held by people in Asia, it's being held by people, some people in China, the Middle East, especially those in Europe. And it comes back to the fundamental idea of the underlying asset, which is the dollar losing value. And because the entire world is built on US bonds, and US bonds is supporting the dollar itself, obviously to buy bonds, you need to buy dollars. And when there's no demand for bonds, the demand for dollars also goes down. So we are having really two tsunamis crashing onto the entire dollar system. Domestic demand in the US is weak. Too much dollars be flooded back within the system itself. And that's why, the prices are going up. Standard of living within the United States is dropping. And within the financial side, when you look at people on Wall Street, when you look at other investors out there, holding the dollar is a hot potato. No one wants to hold bonds. Right now, I personally as an investor, I have 0 US bonds in my portfolio. I see no point. Why should I hold it when I believe within the next 5 to 10 years it's going to lose value? I'd rather buy gold, I'd rather buy other stuff right now. So I think the US is really being buffeted by these two tsunamis hitting them, and the curse of the reserve currency is now boomeranging back on them.
Yeah, with that point you made on healthcare, Sean, healthcare is necessary in general, though what we spend on it definitely more of a byproduct of the absolute corruption and profiteering that goes on in our particular system, given that we're the only ones who have this big burden of healthcare costs in the entire world. With that said, first of all, do you have any final comments on this before we move on to a different segment?
I would only add that as I look at the American economy, the way that it is experiencing the decline of the empire, the growing difficulties of a world economy in which the United States' position deteriorates, is actually expressed internally by a very profound and I believe politically destabilizing inequality. In other words, the top 10 or 20% of the American population is now doing what I expect declining empires have probably always seen. That is, the people at the top 10 or 20%, are in positions of political power and economic dominance, that they can use those positions to hold on to their wealth better than anybody else, which means that the costs of the declining empire, the rising costs of imports, the reduction in job opportunities, or the way it plays out, the people at the bottom are required to absorb more than their share of a declining empire, because the people at the top hold on to all of their wealth, or pretty nearly all of it, in one way or another. So you have, for example, the absurd dichotomy in which the stock market in the United States remains elevated when the reality, what Sean said, his friends report the prices going crazy in Walmart or Target or the grocery store or the supermarket. These are signs of a gap widening, and that is political dynamite in the United States, because the one thing that distinguished American capitalism above all from its predecessors, British and European and even Japanese, was the fact that you had in the United States a remarkably large, quote unquote, middle class. It was, of course, workers, but they were better paid than workers in other places had mostly been. Their wages, real wages, rose for most of the 20th century pretty steadily, even across the Great Depression. And it sustained these weird notions of American exceptionalism and the notion of a great middle class. The last 30, 40 years have destroyed this image. We're not exceptional, and we're not middle class. Most of the middle class is enraged as it experiences its destruction down back into the working class, which they thought they had forever escaped. That contradiction, that anger, that explains Mr. Trump. He rides that anger into office. And the Democrats lose the working class, which they had inherited because of Franklin Roosevelt and the New Deal. They've now lost it because they not only could they not bring the working class up from what they had gotten in the New Deal, they couldn't even preserve what the New Deal had gotten for them. They were the weak sister of the Republicans, exposed as that, and so the population goes the other way for a while. That'll change again. But right now, I think what most endangers the United States as a culture, as a society, is the fact that the division between rich and poor is, in my judgment, even more unsustainable than the debt.
Well, Professor Wolff, how about we stay with you? I wanted to talk about how, we began with talking about U.S. bond holdings being dropped more and more in China and around the world, the U.S. dollar being in trouble. And I believe there's a bigger economic context that undergirds all of this. The Atlantic has sounded the alarm recently, talking about how China builds, America litigates, literally talking about just China's immense industrial policy, how it leads, these critical rare earth minerals and the magnets that are needed to produce them, that are so important in so many industries. And it goes on and on and on, talking about even the history of how China went from a country without a highway just 30 years ago to now having this incredible transportation system, all these logistics, leading and shipping, containing, even in military technology, drones, all of this. But there's a response to all of this that not only affects the US dollar, but the US empire as a whole and its standing. We have, for example, Secretary of Treasury, Sean, I know you often are covering what he is saying and doing with regard to US economic policy. Here is his view on how Europe should be behaving at the moment as the US's ally or vassal, better put.
He's been putting a lot of pieces in place over the last couple of weeks and days, so he's going to go in a very strong position. And then two, I want to say that it is time for our European counterparts to put up or shut up. They keep saying, oh, the US should do this, US should do that. President Trump has put secondary sanctions or secondary tariffs on India because of their consumption of Russian oil, and the Europeans haven't done that yet. As a matter of fact, the Europeans are buying the refined products that the Indian refiners make. So we need some coordination here. So if we are going to have a united front, which will give President Trump maximum leverage, then I think that our European counterparts need to do their part.
So Europe has to go the way of the US, Professor Wolff. And then lastly, I want to show you Secretary of State, or so he claims. It's unclear whether it's he or Lindsey Graham at this point. But here is what Marco Rubio said about this economic policy. You know, a lot of criticism has come on Trump for tariffing India harder than ever before and not raising tariffs on China. Here is Marco Rubio's response.
Well, I mean, wouldn't that be a major lever to pull, to put sanctions on Europe or punish Europe for continuing to buy oil and gas from Russia? Is that something on the table?
Well, I don't know about on Europe directly, obviously, but certainly there are implications to secondary sanctions. If you put secondary sanctions on a country, let's say you were to go after the oil sales of Russian oil to China. Well, China just refines that oil. That oil is then sold into the global marketplace, and anyone who's buying that oil would be paying more for it, or if it doesn't exist, would have to find an alternative source for it.
So I want to stop there because I think that is the key point. Professor Wolff, your reaction to this, because I think it ties into your analysis of the dollar decline as well as the broader decline of U.S. empire in it, admitting that, if the U.S. plays certain cards, if it goes harder on the tariffs, then it blows back pretty disastrously.
Well, as I read the literature, and I'm going to be blunt here because I think the basic point is easily made. As I read the literature on sanctions, they don't work. And I don't even think anymore that anybody takes that stuff seriously, except in the mass media, because it allows President Trump and his associates that you just showed us to talk like we're the big, powerful country that we once were but aren't anymore. It's biblical. The Lord is smiting the infidel. That's what it sounds like. We're going to hit them with a tariff, and we're going to hit them with a sanction. And this is, if you pardon me, bullshit. It is political theater for the American public. Other than that, everybody knows what Mr. Rubio just said. Everybody knows that, especially with basic commodities like oil and gas, that yes, it's an irritation to make you go from country A to country B and then refine it and then sell it to country C rather than what you used to do, or move it in a ship that is different from the ships you used to use, or to move it from one ship to another in a harbor or outside a harbor. I mean, it's all very well documented how you get around it. This is not something that works. Even in terribly poor countries that have almost no way to get around it, they get around it. The United States has been sanctioning Cuba for 70 years and can't change the government there, even though that's been the goal from day one. And Cuba is a very poor country and always has been. By comparison, the resources available to a China or even a Russia to get around these sanctions is legendary. The books filled with examples are taken from the failed sanctions, particularly of Russia, but also now of China. So for me, I find this very hard watching the Secretary of Finance babbling on in this childish way. He knows better. And if he doesn't, they're in much worse trouble than I think we are. He knows better, but he intones that kind of language because his leader, the boss, wants it spoken like that. Just the way they discussed the meeting between Putin and Trump over the weekend in these arcane, media-infested language that doesn't allow them to see what actually happened because they have to rehearse their scripts, which they've been telling us for weeks and months anyway.
Yeah, and Sean, definitely want your reaction to this because I know you've been covering, you see how sanctions and tariffs are essentially equated with each other by the Trump administration, which is, they're not the same thing, but they're being used in the same way, which has had a dramatic impact. So talk about this, especially in relation to Europe's posture and overall what this reflects about the global economic changes we are seeing.
Sure, I think to Professor Wolff's point, sanctions never work. They have never worked in history before. We can go all the way back to Napoleon's time, when he decided to impose a continental system on the entire of Europe in order to get the entire continent not to trade with Britain. What happened at the end of the day? Imperial Russia broke it, and that led eventually to Napoleon's downfall. And if we look at the Japanese War, World War II, when the US decided to sanction Japan, cut away all the oil supply to them, a lot of academics, a lot of people say that directly contributed to Pearl Harbor. And if we fast forward all the way towards the sanctions on Russia, what happened? Russia's economy didn't collapse. In fact, it outgrew the entire of the G7, it outgrew Europe by leaps and bounds, right? Maybe 3 or 4 times more growth. And Russia actually began the process of de-dollarizing their entire economy together with China. And if we look at what they're trying to do to get the entire Europe now to gang up on BRICS, to justify the sanctions on India, to justify the sanctions on China, that is only going to destroy the dollar even further, and that is going to destroy Europe's industries even further if they concede to what Scott Bessent or what Trump wants. And we just need to think about it. Europe is in a very horrific posture, in a very horrific place right now. They still have an energy crisis. They have dedicated themselves to buy more expensive US LNG, which is insane. It's probably 50 to 100% more expensive than what they got from Russia in the past. And because of that, they are losing a lot of market share to the Chinese, who's a manufacturing superpower, right? Whatever advantage that Europe lost from cheap Russian commodities has flowed to China. So now they are in a very big pickle. We know that Europe relies a lot on the US for trade. And if they were to go against Scott Bessent, there's always a chance for the tariffs to maybe double or go up to maybe 40%, even 50%, who knows? However, on the flip side, if Europe really goes against China and embargoes China and decides to impose a very big wall of tariff, what are they cutting themselves away from? Cheap Chinese manufacturing goods, most of which are intermediate goods, most of which are inputs needed to make European products at the same time. This can be car parts, this can be solar panels, this can be chemicals, all the base materials to build the stuff that Europe exports to the world. So, damn if they do, damn if they don't. And this is why I'm leaning more towards the side that Europe is not going to comply. Because if they actually do that, we just need to think about it. If they do comply, the eventuality is that a lot of EU industries will be destroyed. A big part of it will be relocated to the United States because they simply can't manufacture in Europe, and they need to sell to the US consumer because that is a tariff market that blocks away China effectively. So the entire idea of made in Europe will be extinct, and European companies will be effectively American, with just a Wikipedia entry that this was founded in Europe, but actually operating all the way in the United States. And at the end of the day, if this was to go on, it will just create a bigger US colony, and all dollars eventually will still circulate over there. The debt will build up even to bigger monstrous levels. And yes, that might help the United States survive for maybe a few more years, 5 years, maybe even a decade. But it's just kicking the can down the road. You're still going to have a dollar implosion at the end of the day.
Yeah, I mean, that's what it seems like, Professor Wolff. A lot of this is kind of kicking the can down the road, trying to offset the cost of this declining empire onto Europe. And Europe has been so far willing to comply as much as it can. I mean, look at the way that they're trying to rescue the Ukraine conflict, despite the fact that we haven't really seen much in the way, other than optics, of pulling away from that. But talk about the broader impact of this attempt by the United States to offset the cost of this empire onto everybody, it seems, its own citizens, Europe, the rest of the world. And now we see, of course, with the Atlantic article talking about China's rapid development, it seems like what really angers the United States when it comes to China and BRICS is that these countries are looking to do the opposite of allowing the US to offset the cost of their empire onto them. And that seems to be a huge problem that they want to resolve. Even what Scott Besson was saying about Russia speaks to this, that the US wants maximum leverage against Russia so that it can pull Russia down. And that seems to always be the goal here. Professor Wolff, what are your thoughts?
Well, I want to go back to my metaphor, my image of a web. And when you destabilize a complex web that's developed over decades, you set in motion things you cannot control and you cannot predict. And when you behave as though you can, trouble is coming, serious trouble. And I think we're already seeing it, we're feeling it, we're watching it around us. And again, I think it's symptomatic of a declining empire. Declining empire, when the Roman Empire started to fall apart, it organized its understanding of the rest of Europe between the Holy Roman Empire and the savage tribes in the rest of Europe. Well, okay, I mean, you understand why people do that, but it's not a serious idea. It tells you that from being docile and agreeable, the people that you lorded it over in your empire are now, shooting back at you and don't want to be in the empire. Why am I telling you this? Because things can change very quickly. Lenin is famous for having said to his frustrated colleagues before the revolution succeeded, "It's taking so long," they said to him. And he famously answered them, "For decades, nothing seems to happen. And then in a few weeks, decades happen." I think there's lots of wisdom there, and I'm going to give you one example. Over the last several days in France, there has been a massive outpouring of demands in the population that the government of Mr. Macron and his Prime Minister Bayrou quit. It's literally a mass demand for a general strike on the 10th of September, demanding the end of their government. And it's the result of an accumulation of bitternesses. The money spent on Ukraine that is being taken away from the generous social welfare system that the French created after World War II, even earlier after the Great Depression. And it's very important to understand. There's a poll in Germany a week ago that indicates that the governing political party, the Christian Democrats, for the first time come in second to the Alternative für Deutschland, which is a right-wing but Ukraine war protest against the government. Mr. Trump is in a way a protest against the conventional government. The mayor of New York, likely to be in the fall, as things stand now, and I'm reporting to you from New York, will be a supporter of Palestine, a critic of Zionism, a Muslim activist man who will probably win here in New York because of a massive disinclination to continue the political status quo. I wonder to myself, as I read the financial press in Germany, when finally the German industrialists, who understand what Sean said a few minutes ago only too clearly, will get rid of Mr. Merz, who, by the way, used to work for an American conglomerate in Germany, being in charge of it for Germany. Get rid of him and make a determined switch to try to resuscitate German industry before everything becomes even more subordinated to the United States than they were since the end of the Second World War.
Yeah, Sean, talk about this convergence we see, or this divergence, I should actually say, because on the one hand, you have the European Union, European countries really kowtowing as much as they can. You say that there's a limit to this, and I believe that's true. But at the same time, they're doing everything they can to follow the United States down this path of certain collapse. And then you have China, as the Atlantic pointed out, not doing that. China is really pursuing massive industrial policy, and with it, the strengthening of BRICS and a multipolar world where this industrial policy can be supported on a global scale. So talk about this difference, because I think it really gets to the divergences too of the economic basis of these two diverging developments.
Right. I think we have to realize that China actually lives in the real world, the real physical world, where manufacturing is might, where actually propagating your power to trade is their game plan. However, the US lives in a world of paper derivatives. They live in the financial system, and for them, everything is the stick. Oh, there isn't any carrot, right? It's just a stick. It's just sanctions and punishments. Now, if we look at how China is actually waging the entire economic war, it's been 30 to 40 years in the making. They go around the world, they dominate supply chains, and they try to make their entire manufacturing base as strong as possible. And this inherently comes at the core of what China is trying to do. As the US goes around propagating their strength through the US military, through financial sanctions, and the power of the dollar, China is doing it a little differently. They are making themselves very useful to the world in terms of finished goods, in terms of manufacturing. And that is both a sword and a shield. Now, the sword, we already know what that means, right? They have a bigger trade surplus, they earn more from the world, the money can be put back into their industries, and it grows from there, right? You earn $1 trillion in surplus, you can put your money into gold, you can put your money to build up your own industries, can subsidize them, and can help other BRICS members build up their entire ecosystem when it comes to energy, when it comes to commodities, when it comes to building factories. Now that part, I think everyone here understands. But a deeper layer, when we go deeper, peel back the onion, China's manufacturing power also sanction-proofs them from the world. Now, China is the biggest trading partner to over 100 or maybe 125 countries. So what does China actually do? They export cheap products to the world. In a sense, they export deflation, right? Conversely, the US sends a lot of dollars out there, so they export inflation. So when China exports deflation, it makes the whole world dependent in a good way to Chinese products, right? And that's why when the US, when Scott Bessent decided to come with his ridiculous idea of Fortress America, trying to get Latin America, the Mexicans, including the Canadians, to form this kind of united war against China, no one wanted to do it because they know at the end of the day, They need to trade with China. The economy is slowly going up. Consumption is going up there as well. But the more immediate impact is that they need cheap Chinese goods for them to export their own stuff to the US, export their own stuff to the world, and to keep inflation low. So China kind of understands this mechanism. And if we look at how they are going to propagate this power going forward, they are definitely moving more towards the technology side when it comes to AI, when it comes to chips. And let's touch on this a little bit as well. Now, we know that Trump wants to create a 300% tariff on chips so that, all these big companies will be moving to the US, like TSMC, and hopefully, I think what Trump wants is for Korean companies like SK Hynix, to get their behind to the United States as well. Now, China, well, they have come up with a directive telling their companies not to buy NVIDIA's AI chips, H20 chips. Don't buy them. You want to buy them, you better give us good reason. And there's a big understanding for this, right? Because if China doesn't radically create their own chips through Huawei or through their own technology, semiconductor companies, they're going to lose the manufacturing battle for the future. And if you lose that, you're going to lose a very big shield that will protect you from US sanctions, right? Whoever controls semiconductors in the future, let's say China manages to do it, which I believe they will, well, the US sanctions on you is going to be very ineffective. Countries around the world, they'll say, thank you, but no thank you. You still need Chinese chips to run our factories, run our robots, run our industries. Why? Well, basically they're 20%, 30%, 50% cheaper than US AI chips, and most probably it's just a trade transaction, right? That probably isn't going to be any, terms and conditions or whatever Trojan horse inside as well. So I think China understands where the strategic book lies, and I think they're playing their cards rather well. They're following the game plan.
Speaking of that, Professor Wolff, I don't know if you've been following, I'm sure you have been, this development that I think is quite astounding and speaks to what we've been talking about today. The New York Times, everyone though in the West, and especially the United States' establishment media, has been sounding the alarm about a trend after the United States after Besant slapped and Trump the 50% tariff threat onto India with really they haven't really pulled back from this at all. Right after that, India announced that they're going to go to the Shanghai Cooperation Organization meeting, and Modi and Xi Jinping are going to meet, and that they're opening up all kinds of economic opportunities between each other that weren't really available because of sour relations before. So this has really set off the establishment media, but this has been a trend that's been going on for quite some time, especially with the tariffs. Your assessment of this, Professor Wolff?
Well, I'm struck by that story in the New York Times, and here I'll tell you why. I think the same story can be told, is now being told, that the decision to move NATO eastward far enough so that the Russians would be provoked into making that invasion of Ukraine was a mistake, an immense mistake, because it was premised on an inadequate understanding of the BRICS. The statements made early after the invasion, so in other words, starting in March of the year 2022, you had statements from the President of the United States, Mr. Biden at the time, on down, that the ruble would collapse, that Russia would collapse, that Russia would be divided into a dozen different regional small countries that would presumably become subordinate to the West, blah, blah, blah. The idea that Russia could turn to its BRICS allies, namely India and China, and sell to them the oil and gas that the Europeans were cutting off, apparently didn't occur to them. Now that's taking denial of the changing world economy, denial of the declining American position, denial of the whole decline of the empire, to the level of immediate tactical misstep. And here we are 3 years into the war in Ukraine. They still are struggling not to have to admit that the Russians won, and they pushed Russia closer to China, having had the hope of doing the opposite. I see this thing with India as interesting, not because they made the mistake again. That isn't so interesting. Pathetic, but not interesting. But what's interesting is that the New York Times and others see it. They, right from the beginning, they see that the cost of this sanction effort, the hitting, because that's what it is, sanctioning India by means of a tariff, that it will be very costly in the longer run and in the bigger picture. I'm struck that it's happening this quickly after the mistake is made. I think something is shifting.
Yeah. I mean, India was supposed to be the pearl for the United States in all forms of this war, economic, military, that the United States is trying to push forward in order to save its economic status as superpower, the dollar, all of it. And there's been a lot of talk, Sean, and maybe we can get the final comments on this. It really is everybody. The Trump administration has really unleashed what is an economic war on the entire world, even as it says it's trying to wage peace in Ukraine, which I find dubious. But, the funds that were stolen, as you said earlier, have not been given back to Russia. And there's tariffs on literally everyone. I mean, we even have Vietnam. We even have Pakistan. We have countries that are supposed to be the chips that are supposed to fall on the side of the U.S. against China, against Russia. All of these, Europe, tariffs, India, tariffs. I mean, it's everyone. So, Sean, what do you make of it? I mean, why then? Why? Because I think you've laid out so clearly on your channel just all of the drawbacks of this.
Sure. I think when it comes to the trade war, Trump basically has two dual playbooks that he's running at the same time. And it becomes very clear once we look behind the curtain, right? See the Wizard of Oz pulling all the levers. Now, the first thing he's trying to do is that he realizes that the entire US debt situation is going out of control, and the world sooner or later will not want to subsidize the entire US economy. So when it comes to the tariffs, despite what Besson is saying, despite what Trump is saying, who is really paying for the tariffs? I would say the bulk of it are US consumers. And if we look at all the weird kind of maneuvering being done by the Trump administration, telling tech companies like Nvidia, AMD to give 15 or 20% of their Chinese revenues to the US government, the federal government, the entire playbook is very, very clear. This is basically one big private sector bailout for the US government, right? A lot of money is coming from the US people, from the citizens, from the consumers, and a lot of money is going to come from all these tech companies, and I believe more companies down the road, because there's just not enough money for the US government to spend. And in no way can we go back to the old playbook of 2008 and 2020 to print money at a time when there's more or less no big crisis going on right now. We'll just create an entire debasement crisis, and de-dollarization will go out of hand. At the same time, Trump is also trying to run the playbook of shock and awe to the entire world. He's running his art of the deal, basically frightening everyone to move their industries to the United States. Now, a lot of countries, so-called, has promised him a lot of things, $500 billion. I've heard crazy numbers of Lutnick saying 5 trillion, 10 trillion. But the problem is that will all this materialize? The thing is that a lot of countries right now, they're just waiting for the US system to crack. They've already seen it crack in April, when the entire bond market actually forced Trump to backtrack and put the entire world on a 90-day truce, 60 or 90-day truce, right? The tariffs were still flat at 10% and they go up. So everyone right now is just waiting for the US to crack, but Trump is still upping the ante. He's basically giving a show hand at the poker table, and everyone honestly is very pissed off. So at this point, you can just understand that the world is now looking for alternatives, and they are looking more towards not just China but the entire BRICS bloc as well. And this isn't going to be very good for the dollar, for US bonds going forward. And unfortunately, Trump has trapped himself in this situation where he can neither really advance without hurting the future of US industries, neither can he retreat because he has already thrown all the cards on the table, and his strongman persona just refuses to give him any leeway to go back. So I don't think the prognosis for the US economy is very good, and I think unfortunately we might be in a doom spiral.
Professor Wolff, your final thoughts as we close up here on this. As I said before, I mean, Sean says the United States economy is in a doom spiral as it currently stands, and then you also have just tariffs on everyone. Brazil, 50%, everyone. BRICS is supposed to be the target, according to the Trump administration, but really the entire world is. So your final thoughts.
Yeah, the entire world is, because the tariffs was an attack on the entire world. Very few countries escaped. Mostly one looked at which country got hit a lot. So one look at Vietnam and, shakes one's head, given the history, even more so. But again, I return, and I admit that this is my focus, I return to what is going on inside the United States as we go through all of this. And so let me close by an observation. What Mr. Trump has done has two qualities that I believe will undercut whatever the objectives exactly were from the sanctions and the tariffs and all the rest of the political theater. The first one is that around the world, people will identify the United States as an unstable, uncertain economic partner. If you're an exporter, you do not want to depend on an economy that is described by the adjectives I just used. If you import from the United States, same logic. And if you invest in the United States, again, the same logic. You're not going to do it. Even if there were a temporary profit, the uncertainty, Sean spoke to that earlier, the up and down quality, delay this, raise that, lower that, means you cannot make a rational decision, and gambling on the United States is not what people are used to doing. They are used to having the most stable place imaginable to put your wealth. Even if your project doesn't work, it's a safe place to store your wealth. It'll probably go up in value. All of that has been disturbed. And now the second part of the same story. In every country, whether it's the BRICS or not the BRICS, whether it's a socialist regime or not a socialist regime, the political leaders and the economic leaders in every country will now be offered a wonderful opportunity to take advantage of the fact that the United States has become understood to be a dangerous, powerful, rogue nation. Every politician will blame whatever the problems are that politician either cannot or will not solve on the United States, and there'll be a grain of truth to it. Every corporation looking for an interesting new advertising theme will try to cash in on hostility to the United States to boost sales of its own competing products, to get local politicians to do something good for them that might be costly to the United States, to cash in on the hostility, on the anger. I recently spent a few weeks in Montreal, Canada. I spoke to as many people as I could, and all I heard were people who are not going to be visiting the United States as tourists, even though they've done that once or twice a year for decades. They are not buying American goods. They are looking for alternative markets. If they sold into the United States, I was regaled with this all the time. And my suspicion is, more or less, that's going on everywhere. And my guess is that the costs of what I've just said to the American economy will far outweigh whatever benefits trickle in from those few who react to the tariffs or the sanctions in the way that the Americans would like them to.